Let's talk about growing old. I don't know if it's just me or I feel like this current age, I'm 39 years old, and I feel like after 35, a lot of things about life and the way you perceive life, the lens in which you see the world starts to change. And there are things that you learn to appreciate more. There are things about yourself that you learn. There are things about the world that you learn. And I think this idea of perspective becomes so relevant because at any point in time, no matter what the situation is, all it takes is a change in perspective to shift your body or your head or your position to look at it from a different angle, and it changes your entire attitude and the entire way you think about that thing. And I've been having a lot of these thoughts lately, and I think it's important for me to sort of timestamp where I am currently because I think each year as I progress in age and experience, I have these revelations and I want to have some sort of archive of where I was or what I thought at that point. And it's a bonus to get to share it with the world. Maybe someone else shares these thoughts that I'm just going to ramble about. So here's what brought this on. 2 nights ago, I had three of the wildest dreams I've ever had. Well, not ever had, but man, it was a wild night. It was a wild night to have dreams. And dreams are just so it's 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 astounding. It's astounding how the brain works. Let me give you an example. Here's one of the dreams I had. Before I get into like this whole perspective thing, here's one of the dreams I had. So in one of the dreams, my wife calls me on the phone in this dream and she says, "Hey, babe, some people came over. I gave them consent to go into our house and now they're robbing us." Which is already like I guess crazy, right? Like you give them consent, they're in your house, they're robbing you. And she's like, just like in some sort of movie, they're like, if you try to call the police or contact the authorities, we'll know. Like we've got your phones tapped and we will take action. And so she tells me this. And I'm like, no, that's crazy. Like we gotta go to the police. And so before I even get home in the dream, I call the police. But for some reason, it's just ringing and ringing and ringing. Like 911 isn't working. And I'm like, am I going to get put on voicemail? And so it just continues to ring. So I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm just going to drive to the police station. And why in your dream, why is nothing ever the exact same, right? It's always some alternate universe version of your house, of your car, of your situation. But anyway, I drive to the police station and for some reason it's like on like a campus. It's not a regular police station. And so I go in there and there's this like campus police person. And all I really need someone to do is get in contact with the police. And so I asked him, hey, can you call the police? Because apparently they've got my phone tapped, so I can't get through to the police. And so this person calls the police for me. And as soon as the lady picks up and I tell her the situation, I'm like, hey, my wife let some people in our house and they're robbing us and they're taking all of our stuff. And she goes, "Sir, I talked to your wife and I'm so sorry, but there's nothing we can do. Your wife gave them consent, and because they have consent, technically we can't say that they're robbing you because your wife let them in." And this is where the brain is wild because I've been in situations before where I've tried to get the authorities involved, and because of some sort of crazy loophole, they weren't able to get involved. And this just like makes sense. This makes sense that this could be a scam or a thing, right? Someone, they get you to give consent to come into your home, and they know that that's the loophole. And so now they can take whatever they want because you gave them consent to go in, and the police or the authorities can't do anything about it. It's it's such a wild dream. It's so scary because it can happen, and I think that's what makes it so scary. So anyway, that's one of the wild dreams I have. Immediately, the next morning, I told my wife, "Hey, don't let nobody in our house. Like, I'm sure this isn't in your character. You wouldn't do this, but just in case, we don't want this dream to come true." And so I have, this series of crazy dreams, and one of the dreams made me wake up and I couldn't fall back to sleep. And I decided to get on Facebook and look through all the messages, the archive of messages from people I've known who have known me at different phases, different perspectives, different versions of who I am. And as I'm going back and I'm reading through these messages, you get a chance to see, like, it's a timestamp of who you were at that moment. Because, these conversations that you're having in the DMs, it's interesting what you're saying, what that other person is saying, and then you at your current age having the benefit of hindsight, looking back on that and reading in between the lines and knowing the context of like why you said that, or if you were too busy. And it's just, as I'm going through, there were like multiple people in there who are no longer with us. And these conversations that I have on record like solidifies my memories or my interactions with those individuals. And I think that's what made me think about, if someone went back and looked at the conversations that they had with me, how would they remember me? What version of Hemory would they have gotten? I don't know. It's such, I don't, I know. It's such a deep philosophical thing. And so, as I'm going back, I'm looking at like past DMs between. Here's the thing. I think as a man, as you get older, and especially as when you become a father, and when you become the father of daughters, I think your perspective on how you treat women should change. Doesn't always, but I think it should change because now you have a newfound respect because you're raising a woman and you want someone else to treat your daughters with respect and dignity and all those things. And I look back at some of these DMs and I'm like, that's not the version of Hemory that I want my daughters to experience. And you read some of these conversations and you think about where you were at in that frame of life, and you miss things. Like, there are things in those conversations because we have this innate desire to just like quickly and rapidly move through life, that you miss out on these, like, it feels like the subtitles of your life. Like, you ever like watch a TV show with subtitles and they tell you something that gives context to the scene that you can't even hear. It wasn't even an audible thing that they were subtitling. It was just probably written in the script that they just added it to it, in the stage directions, if you will. Yeah, I feel like those are some of the things you get when you go back to these conversations. And some of these conversations, you're like, you even missed. You just left the person on red, and it's 10 years now later, and you're like, man, I didn't respond to you, and I haven't talked to you since then. And maybe that was the demise of that relationship. Or you wonder why you haven't talked to a person in a long time and the last thing was like a message that they sent you that was left unread. And you're like, maybe that's why we haven't talked. And you get to just like realize these nuances in relationships that you had with people, with women, and you could see how different you were. One of those messages that I came across was from this woman who I had met through a dating app. One of the times I tried to move to Florida. Moving to another state is a difficult to it. I don't know why it's so difficult, but it's just difficult. For me, it was difficult. I've tried to move to Florida a couple of times. Maybe it's just Florida. Maybe I should just avoid trying to move to Florida and move somewhere else. But anyway, I moved to Florida on a whim. I was young, and I think me and my ex-girlfriend had just broken up, and so it felt like a great opportunity to just like reset and restart life. But who knew that trying to move and establish yourself and get a job would be so difficult in another state? And it was. Not only like the job thing and the social thing, I was lonely. I felt like I needed someone, and so I got on one of these free sites, Plenty of Fish, and I ended up meeting this woman. And I was sort of in this small town called Lake Placid, Florida. It's a retirement town. So I was there at Lake Placid, and this woman lived in northern Florida. And so there was a sort of a distance between us. And her and I have been chatting for a while, and as you do on these sites, right? Like you know, it's a lot of messages, and then eventually you exchange numbers. And I don't even think back then like video calls were like a thing, uh, or FaceTiming. So wait, maybe it was. What was it called? Was it Skype? I can't remember. Anyhow, we decide that we were gonna meet up in a central location and do a weekend together. And back then, although I was wild, I was respectful, right? So I didn't have expectations outside of, hey, let's meet, let's hang out, let's have a great weekend. So we ended up getting a hotel room, and she was like adamant about getting the hotel room together. But again, I'm respectful, so I make sure that the hotel room that we got, had two different beds so that we can just like coexist. And I don't want to make any assumptions. Anyway, nothing happened in the way that you think things would happen if you're in a hotel room with a romantic interest. Nothing happened, but we did have a good weekend, and I think maybe one or two more visits. I ended up coming down to or up to where she lived, met her family, and we hung out a couple more times. But then by then the my situation in Florida just wasn't working out. I couldn't find a job because I didn't have a Florida driver's license, and I couldn't get a Florida's driver's license without a birth certificate, and I didn't have my birth certificate because I had to get it back in Michigan. And so there was all these things that were just like stacked against me, where I just had to move. And then there was a job opportunity back home, so I just had to move back home. And so I chose to end the thing that her and I had. And it really wasn't anything because we were dating, and that was it, right? I I really wasn't interested at that time in a relationship. She was from another country, and she told me that there was this possibility of her having to go back to the country. I knew that I would probably go back to Michigan, and so I didn't have intentions on building a relationship with her. And so I wanted to make sure that that was clear. Because again, I had just gotten out of some really long relationship, and it lasted longer than it should have because we weren't clear in our communication on where we stood. And so I wanted to make sure that I was clear this time. So I was clear to her, and I let her know that, hey, this probably isn't going to work. I'm going to leave. It's been great. And we can be friends. We can stay in contact. And so I did leave. Now it brings us back to this archive, this messages that we have, because we were friends on Facebook. And I look in the messenger and she's in there. Again, like during the time, I didn't think about this, but every single day for it had to be 3 months, she would send me messages over and over. And they were basically just messages to herself. Like she at a certain point, she understood that I wasn't responding. And so she would just still send the messages. And I've done this before, right? Like you fall for someone, and even if it's not reciprocated, you feel that you owe it to yourself to express how you feel about that person and put that out in the universe, because if you don't, then you regret that you never did it. And so this was her. This was her doing that daily. And I'm scrolling through these messages, not really reading them word for word, but some of them I'm giving some context to just to see what she's saying. And yeah, I don't know. I thought about I should have responded. I shouldn't have left her on read like that and let her continue to send these messages without giving her some sort of closure, I suppose. And then I see that I eventually did, like months afterwards. And then we correspond cordially for a moment or two. And then she disappears. And then she comes back and she says that, hey, I'm having a baby. And and then you get nervous because you're like, wait a minute, we didn't. Whose baby? And it's like, oh, she's just letting me know that she's moved on. She's in a relationship now. She's bringing a child into the world, and that this could be amicable. I think it ends with her saying something nice, and then again, me leaving her on red. And this was all within that year, and I haven't responded since. And this was probably 10 years ago. And I thought maybe I should say, maybe I should say something. But then I'm like, no, you shouldn't. Because what's the point? Why why say anything? Why reignite that flame in her and throw this wrench in whatever, hopefully, whatever happiness she has found? And what benefit would that give you except for, I don't know, some sort of massage to my ego, or, putting good karma into, my karma basket of saying that, like, yes, it feels good that I did actually respond. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But it gave me perspective. After reading her messages, I looked at other messages. I looked at messages between me and a summer fling that I had, who died of cancer a couple years back. And every year her relatives sort of keep her Instagram alive, and they do a memorial post. And every year I feel like I go back and I read some of our earlier messages, when we were catching up after the whole summer thing, because she lived in England. And then I read the messages before she passed, because I had, she was documenting her battle. And I remember reaching out to her, and at this point we're friends. And most of our messages that was in this archive was just us catching up, like how much life had changed since our summer experience, and how we've grown as people. And it was always a couple years between the conversations of like, hey, it's been a while. We follow each other on socials. I see how life is going. I'm glad to see that you're happy. You have a family now, et cetera, et cetera. You know how those sort of like relationships from a distance happen. But yeah, I mean, this one was different because it was the last conversation that we had. And it was, hey, I think she was in remission at this point. And it was like, hey, it's good to see you in good spirits. You fighting this. And then we reminisced on, note that this is like this essentially white woman from the UK, and she was into like R&B and poetry, but she hadn't been on poetry the way that I was on poetry, like Def Poetry Jam poetry. And so I remember like introducing her to this, and we were watching that, and then I remember I was watching one of Kevin Hart's stand-ups. And it was just such a, like, we had no other worries in the world. It was just a cool moment for us. Um, and it's one of those moments that you just have with another person, not sexual, but just like a deep connection and appreciation for the same thing and just vibing. It was just a vibe. Like we were just, yeah, that's it. We were vibing. And it was a good memory. I mean, I think we both needed that at whatever stage that was in our lives. And that conversation, that artifact is what I go back to like remember and memorialize her. I look at those two different interactions and the two different versions of Hemory in those interactions. And I look at the current version, right? I look at the current version of myself and I can see growth. Because again, as a 39-year-old man on his way to 40, life is shifting paradigms, shifting my perspective. And I think when you take the moment to sit back and realize those things, then growth is inevitable. And so here we are, growing up.